All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the World Affairs Council Washington, D.C.'s Global Education Program on Understand ISIL and the Ongoing Conflict in Syria. And is part of our webinar Wednesday series, which offers students, teachers, and the public important information on a timely global issue by having direct access to experts to ask the questions that you want. Interested in learning more about our programs and weekly program updates, please visit our website and join our outreach list. After speaker Aaron Zelin finishes his remarks, we'll open up for questions, which you can send through the chat function within this system. Make sure you state your name and where you are from. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions before the end of the program. For years, ISIS has been gaining ground in Iraq, and over the last several months, they have been in the news on a daily basis. The murders of the 2 American journalists, the murders of people in the region, and humanitarian issues as a result of the violence. Obama and other world leaders have come together to create a coalition to fight this terrorist group. Questions remain on how to deal with the terrorists and the crisis in the region. Aaron Zelin is the Richard Borow Fellow at the Washington Institute, where how jihadist groups are adjusting to the new political environment in the era of Arab uprisings and the Salafi politics in countries transitioning to democracy. A PhD candidate at King's College of London and a fellow at its Associated International Center for Study of Radicalisation and Political Violence. He was a research associate for the Dr. Jait Clausen's Western Jihadism project at Brandeis University. They was responsible for collecting and analyzing a wide range of primary source materials from Western jihadists and works, including documents in Arabic. He created a detailed library of all jihadist plots against the West since the mid-1990s and the key individuals behind them. He is a frequent contributor to Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and the Atlantic, and is author of the New America Foundation's 2013 study, The State of the Global Jihad Online. He independently maintains the widely cited website jihadology.net and co-edits the blog al-Sharia. So please join me in welcoming Aaron. And just a moment while I transition and pass over to him.
And thanks for having me today. Obviously, this is an extremely timely topic. I'll see if I can figure out how to do my debut. So what's going on the PowerPoint presentation, possibly. Is it seen?
I can see it.
Okay, great. So then I'll start. So remembering the Islamic State, because while it might be shiny and new for many individuals, the group itself goes back many years. For example, they've just changed their name a number of times. So just to give brief history, the group originally started in 1999-2000 by Shab al-Zarqawi, called the group Jabhat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, and went to Afghanistan. He was released from prison in a prisoner amnesty in Jordan. Started training some individuals, and as the U.S. invaded Iraq, he and a number of individuals were in Iraq at the time and started doing attacks on coalition forces. Because of this, he started to gain prestige and media attention, but he didn't necessarily have large resources, money, access to foreign fighters, access to other things. Al-Qaeda itself in Afghanistan, Pakistan after the 9/11 attacks was more or less hidden, but they started to remain relevant, even if over time there were some issues between bin Laden and Zarqawi. Marriage of convenience and created or renamed the organization Al-Qaeda in the Land of Two Rivers, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as most people know from the media. There was a debate within the U.S. political cult, around 6 or so, about whether the U.S. should leave completely. Of course, that former President Bush decided to do the surge instead. But as a result of this, the jihadis in the background were sort of thinking about how they can potentially, figure out the situation once the U.S. left. As a result, Al-Iraq, as well as a number of smaller factions, coalesced into a large organization called the Majlis Shura al-Mujahideen, or consultative council essentially. And later in the year, they did actually an Islamic State, and they decided to call it the Islamic State of Iraq in November 2006. They used this name all the way until April 2013. April 2013, the leader of the group made an announcement that they're officially entering inside of Syria and changed the name to the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham. Al-Sham meaning Levant in English, though I prefer the Arabic because it has more historical and religious resonance, whereas it really doesn't provide that to an individual. And then until June 2004, ISIS name, and then they changed it again to just the Islamic State when they announced the return of the caliphate, according to them. Give idea of what they view as their own territory. So this, of course, spans both Syria and Iraq and had different wilayas in different areas. Of course, is sort of an idea of what they actually control. It's sort of more what they hope to control, but it's not their reality. They've also more recently created a new wilaya which actually straddles between both the Iraqi borders and is a way for them to how they've broken the San Remo borders, which was the agreement which led to these borders, even though many erroneously say Sykes-Picot. In reality, this more of what they are. The black areas are areas of control. The red, pink ones where they're attacking or they have support areas. Still, vast amount of territory, but it's nowhere near the level of control they might put out in propaganda. And of course, their more medium-term goal, besides taking over the entire world, is to retake all Muslim lands that have previously been under past caliphates. So this includes areas that are currently not even Muslim nations at all, such as Spain or parts of the Balkans, all the way up to Vienna, which is a point into Europe where the Ottoman Empire went up to. So the resurgence of this group, one was, of course, the American withdrawal in 2011. That's the most important one, but obviously created more of a space since the U.S. military obviously has more capabilities than the Iraqi military. They're to continue their criminal enterprise after the U.S. left and sort of create Mosul as a safe haven to run business rackets. The Jihad provided new recruits, weapons, and sources of funding. There's and then just in general, the Sunni grievances inside of Iraq. To go further into this in terms of specific events, uprising started around March 2011 when people went into the streets in Daraa after of, I believe, 2 or 3 young boys that were taken away by the Assad regime and tortured to death. Around June, July, protesters created the Free Syrian Army so that they can defend themselves against the attacks of the Assad regime. And over and enter the conflict until January 2012. We were pretty quick in terms of being able to create an end. So at the time, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, in the background had messages with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, which is what they called themselves at the time, to create a new cell within this conflict. Ended up becoming what is Jabhat al-Nusra. A month later, we already started to see the flow of foreign fighters. It become a huge issue until around about May, June, July 2013, when we really saw a huge spike. Moment besides, Jabhat al-Nusra announcing itself in January 2012, with the U.S. designated Jabhat al-Nusra in December 2012. Why important? This is important because over time, Jabhat al-Nusra was primarily focused militarily on attacking the Assad regime's military and security forces. Wasn't really focusing on, dealing with, parts of the Sunni population that they felt weren't truly Islamic in the same way that we saw with Jihad in Iraq last decade. So many analysts were, like, hey, maybe they actually learned some of the lessons of last decade and successes, ingratiate themselves within society. The other rebel groups as well as civilians. And when the U.S. designated them, there was actually a whole campaign by those in Syria, that they're all Jabhat al-Nusra, and that this terrorism that you talk about, the terrorism is truly of the Assad regime, and it's not Jabhat al-Nusra. In some ways, this has replayed itself in the last week, actually, after the U.S. has done airstrikes on Jabhat al-Nusra. So that, the U.S. hasn't necessarily learned that lesson in the last 2 years is quite eye-opening. But the fact that people like Jabhat al-Nusra inside of Syria, Iraq decided to officially announce publicly that it was in Syria and say publicly what everybody knew privately, that the Islamic State of Iraq and Jabhat al-Nusra were actually one and the same, and that just was a branch of them since they're paying 50% of their salary every month. But surprisingly, Jabhat al-Nusra did not want to go with this plan. They believed that they should be operating in Syria and the Islamic State should only be operating in Iraq. As a result, the leader of the group, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, and pretty much said that, look, Iraq will stay in Syria, but we'll continue this, and it'll be for the benefit of everybody. Then Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, the entire network, put out a message saying more or less the same thing, but then Baghdadi responded being like, I don't follow the Sykes-Picot borders. The only person I listen to is God, who is the true sovereign, and they'll continue with their push into Syria, and this is when they changed their name to ISIS. And the fact that they started being able to gain new fighters, specifically foreigners, new resources, they were able to take over territory in some of the areas that have already been liberated by the mainstream Syrian rebels as well as Jabhat al-Nusra. But as a result of this, there then became a conflict between ISIS and these other rebels because they started honing in on more and more of their resources and territory, and it is the central crisis for many backlash that started on December 31st, 2013, but the main offensive really started in January and went to February, which essentially pushed the Islamic State out of Idlib province entirely, which is the northwest of the country, as well as Aleppo province, which is just east of it, pushed into more of the eastern part of the country only in Al-Raqqa province and Deir ez-Zor province. But because of this, along with the fact that there was a failed mediation and reconciliation process between Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, for the first time ever, disaffiliated itself with one of its branches. Of the Islamic State, were been part of Al-Qaeda's network since 2006, after Zarqawi was killed. It's a little more complicated. They still work together. It's probably more than since April 2013, when they announced themselves into Syria, that they truly weren't really a part of Al-Qaeda anymore. But that sort of formalized it. After February 2014, we saw for the first time open fighting going on between the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra. But February 2014, there was sort of this agreement about how they should just focus on the Assad regime, not fight each other. But when they disaffiliated themselves, this changed the game. This is when the Islamic started gaining even more stature among the foreigners because they saw them as having the true will of around. In terms of the Iraq side of things, this started, of course, with the U.S. withdrawal in December 2011. At this, you saw Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI, in the Mosul region and running business rackets, and this is a way to sort of build their sort of operations back up again after being, not completely defeated, but decimated by Surge, as well as the Sahwa movement. Then, July 2012, which they believe was a time when they were strong enough, they started a campaign called Breaking the Walls, where they focused on Iraqi government officials, assassinating members of the Sahwa movement, and they started to build up their capacities once again. The political level, in December 2012, regular Sunnis within Iraq started a protest movement against the Iraqi government because they felt that they had many grievances. Part of it was that the Sahwa movement wasn't, the army or security forces as they're supposed to. Further, it was believed that Maliki had many sectarian policies against. Therefore, they started protests. This continued to go on for a while. Earlier, the Islamic State entered Syria in April 2013, which further provided them more resources that they can then put into Iraq later on, further bolster them. Then, in 2013, there were huge prisons, Abu Ghraib and another one, where at least 500 individuals during the Sahwa. So these are veteran guys that were once again put back and further bolstered the Islamic State. They then started a new campaign called Soldiers Harvest, where they continued to build up capacity, not focusing on sniper operations or terrorism, but more becoming into a true insurgency again. What really changed the game, though, in terms of the side of Iraq, when the Maliki government destroyed the Ramadi press camp. This really vilified the regime as sort of put average Sunnis into being more confrontationist, and that we really saw again of the Naqshbandis, which are a bunch of ex-Baathists, as well as some other Islamists, the Army of Iraq, Ansar al-Islam, and others, and we really started seeing an active, full-scale insurgency again against the Iraqi government, and that's where we first started to see signs that some troubles, because in February this year, Fallujah fell and parts of Ramadi fell. Obviously, what happened in June when Mosul fell as well, and showed the wave of these grievances within the community of the Sunnis. So they collaborated with some of these other factions. The thing is their end game was never to, work with these guys, and they've taken over some territories. They've killed a number of these other insurgents. Sort of, provide the backdrop or framework for where we currently are now in terms of, after June, we started to see the West, other parallel, really worrying about what's going on in the region. One key aspect that's important to highlight, though, to these more military aspects of things, is the role of social services and what they're doing, Jihadi governance. So, if they take over, the Islamic State believes that they're sovereign, so then they start providing law and order, creating new schools where they teach them things related to the Quran, the Hadith, other theology, food, medical services to individuals. So their side of things, them, because last decade when they took control of Anbar province, when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was in control as al-Qaeda in Iraq in around 2005 through 2007, 2008 or so, they only focused on sort of law and order type things. There's no soft power aspect to it or the services. It was just, you were swearing against somebody, whether you were, doing a whether you killed you, there'd be justice for it, whether it's, stoning, cutting off a hand, summarily executing somebody. And recently they've been doing crucifixions. They never did any of the social services, and therefore, even though this, their own interpretations of Sharia, people like it. But these social services, there's become more buy-in, or at least are not necessarily going to say anything because they're relying on the Islamic State so much for these services. What has been going on over the years is related to the foreign fighter mobilization, which I'm sure many have heard about more recently, whether it's about Americans or Western Europeans. Of course, there are also many Arabs as well. So just to give a little bit of context, the contemporary foreign fighter phenomenon really started in Afghanistan after the Soviets invaded. Over a 13-year period, we saw about 5,000 individuals go there. Then in the 90s, we saw about 1,000 in Chechnya. After the fall of the communist regime in the 90s, we saw another 1,000 people go to Afghanistan, especially in the latter years when the Taliban took over. Then after 9/11 in Afghanistan, there was another 1,000 individuals who have gone. That decade, during the height of the Iraq War, the Iraq insurgency, and also al-Qaeda in Iraq, we saw about 4,000 individuals go. In the last about less than 3 years now, I guess, it's about 3 years now, about 10,000. So as we can see, not only is the number unprecedented, but the amount of time that it took for these individuals to go is quite small. So what is the breakdown currently going on in Syria? In Syria, there are estimates up to 15,000 individuals. The estimate of 4,000 is more related to individuals that I've been able to confirm as legitimate people, not just reports about other people without confirming. Looking at this data and going through this over the last 3 years or so, I would say that the likely true number is about 10,000 individuals. Among them, about 90 nations are represented. It's important to note, though, that with many of them are only like 1 to 5 or 10 individuals, not that large. I've been able to about 2,500 martyrdom notices of foreigners inside Syria and now Iraq. And among the draws are from the Arab world, a large chunk, and the second block would be from Western Europe. It's important to note about this 10,000 number. You hear these numbers specifically in the media. When somebody would say 10,000, that's the individuals who have gone from the beginning until what's been going on now. Not necessarily how many people are there at this current point. So it includes people who are currently there, people who are dead, people who have been arrested, and people who have returned home and not been arrested. So you can see those that are currently there is likely smaller. What's really happened? Of course, there's been a steady stream of individuals since Jabhat al-Nusra announced itself in January 2012, but we saw 3 spikes in terms of what has motivated people to go. So the first one was the official public announcement of Jabhat al-Nusra being inside of Syria, which is the first jihadist group inside of Syria. This was the official public announcement that Hezbollah was fighting in Syria, with this huge sectarian was going on inside of the country, since they obviously allowed the Assad regime and started fighting against the majority Sunni population. Say, and pushed many individuals into it because they started seeing it not as a regular necessary war of liberation per se, but also this religious conflict with the Shia. And then, of course, more recently, the announcement of this caliphate by Islamic State in June this year has sort of created another spike in terms of individuals wanting to go to live in the Islamic State. And you not only see just people going there to fight, but people that are going there for other skills as well, like doctors, engineers, people in media, people that are helping buy things related to the social services. So this has sort of been able to expand the pool of individuals who can go to the Islamic State. And we've even seen women and children of these men, and therefore families starting to set up shop there and really creating this true community in their own sense. The main reason for why it's been such an unprecedented mobilization to Syria and now more recently Iraq, majority of foreign fighters are still based inside of Syria. The first is ease of travel. So the people go to get there is inside of Turkey to get to Syria. Going very easy for many places. Also tourist destination, so it doesn't necessarily look as sketchy as, say, if you try and take a plane to get to Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia or Mali. Additionally, the legacy facilitation logistics networks. Second, in Iraq, Syria was actually the staging ground for the foreign fighters, where Turkey currently is the one for the Syrian conflict. So they had this apparatus already in place. Further, you see in local jihadi movements or groups in Western Europe in the past 10 years, you have Hajirun, you have many of their branches in other countries like Sharia for Belgium, Khalidat al-Islam, which I believe is and a host of others. And therefore, these were individuals that could easily be plucked to be recruited over there. Another, social media. So in the past, jihadis were primarily on password-protected forums, so it was a closed ecosystem, and therefore only individuals that knew how to find the forums, as well as then being able to, sort of be able to get a password to get into the forums, would be getting access to it. But they've been able to broadcast to a far wider audience, targeting hashtags, using different methodologies for boosting information in different target audiences. Another reason, which was the original main reason why people started to go, it was the emotional resonance of what was going on in Syria. You had the Assad regime, which was allied sort of via Islam, slaughtering Sunni Muslims, which is the majority of the population, and therefore this resonated so much. It was very visceral for many people in the Muslim world. And of course, you didn't necessarily need to have people being recruited on the message of offensive jihad in terms of, doing a terrorist attack against the West. You're just defending your fellow Sunni Muslim brothers and sisters. This is one of the earlier ones. Then the so-called five-star jihad, where life inside of Syria isn't as bad as, say, other areas of jihad in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Mali. The swimming pools. Some of these villas have, video rooms, very easy to access the internet. So it was seen as a more comfortable version of the jihad for especially the Westerners. Then there's, of course, the religion angle of the historical and millenarian pole. So the caliphate was based in Damascus. It was the Mayyids. Then, in a millenarian sense, the end times prophecies related to Islam really take place in the Syrian territorial world. And as a result, some people started to see things as being some of the signs of the end times. Earlier there's the anti-Shia sentiment, and then more recently there's this project of really state building the Islamic State. And just to get a picture, this is a little old, so might not include maybe a couple of them, but this is the sort of the distribution of where people are going. So you even see some people from Latin America, Europe and the Arab world, but you have other parts in West Africa. And so where does this go now? Regionally, many people are worried about as more incursions in there, as Hezbollah continues to take a more larger role, the military. Then there's Jordan. People worry about Jordan just because it's one of the important allies in the region. But more, they seem to be for many just because, the potential so much Islamic legitimacy for the Islamic State, if they're unable how to, invade Saudi Arabia and take over Mecca and Medina. Of course, that's pretty, at this juncture, but people do worry about these things. And then, we see there are already insurgencies inside of the Sinai with Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, you have Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, you have Uqba bin brigades in Tunisia. So some of these people, when they go back home, can be pushed back into some different group formations with more radicalized ideologies, but new skills on the battlefield that they can present there. And we've seen some of this where some individuals who have been trained inside of Syria and have fought in Syria have been involved in terrorist attacks inside of Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia since. And of course, we saw the case, there's the Western Front, Western Europe, individual who had trained with ISIS, who then did the terrorist attack against the Jewish museum in Brussels. And the unprecedentedness of what many people are worried about will come next, since we have seen foreign fighters in the past be involved in terrorist attacks when they return home. And usually those who have had training abroad compared to sort of homegrown terrorists who have just tried to create their own cell, usually are more violent in many respects. Sort of, the broader picture related to what's been going on in Iraq and related to the Islamic State and how it's all come about, where it's going, and sort of architecture around it. So I look forward to taking your questions now. Thank you.
And I'd like to open up to everyone to chat in their questions now. And while we're waiting for that, where these foreign fighters are coming from. And, as mentioned, the second largest group is coming from Western Europe. And in particular, why? And what that means for Europe.
Yeah, part is just that there's a large Muslim community inside of many European cities, and many individuals in the second and third generation have an identity crisis. They don't feel, say, completely British, but they also feel completely Pakistani. And therefore, the identity of being a Muslim prevents them this, identity. Of course, there are reasons why people get involved as well, but that's a large part of it. And there are, as I noted, already these movements inside of many of these West European capitals and secondary cities, like Al-Hajirun in Britain, you have Sharia for Belgium, you have Sharia for Holland, Khalidat al-Islam in Denmark, you have Fort Saint Eliza in France, and others in other European countries as well. So individuals have been exposed to these ideologies and sort of ways of life for already. This is sort of just the direct logical conclusion of how this is all played out. And some of the failures of the European governments in terms of trying to deal with it over the years, since they did provide a voice for many of these different groups within their own countries over the last decade without really pushing back against it.
A lot of these foreign fighters come back, they're even more violent. A little bit about this international coalition and sort of the response to this, and because it seems very tricky in terms of the involved, particularly in Syria, and if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, extremely complicated in part because the United States and other countries have let it all roll down this hill for 3 years without really doing, even though anyone who's watching this closely knew that this was going to happen, that it was going to continue to get worse and worse. Wouldn't be able to be contained. In terms of what the United States is doing now, or the broader international community, it's sort of, at this point, just peripheral stuff, small things. They're doing against ISIS targets inside Iraq. They're doing against ISIS as well as Jabhat al-Nusra targets inside of Syria. But it doesn't really solve one of the key things, which is the fact that the Assad regime is still in power and slaughtering people inside of Syria. The U.S. is differing, really not having any efforts in helping out the more moderate factions of Syrian rebels, or in 2011 and 2012. The money from the Gulf started going to more radical factions, which made them stronger, which weakened the moderates. And moderates, there really aren't that many, and those that remain really don't have much legitimacy now. You know, I think that there's a major uphill battle. I'm not a military strategist, so I can't really speak to that specifically. But based off of what I've seen already in the last week or two related to what's going on in Syria, it seems like what the U.S. is doing is already making things worse and backfiring. Many people in the rebellion are upset that they al-Nusra, as well as the fact that there have been attacks against other rebel groups that are in the mainstream, hitting grain silos and oil facilities, even though they're run by the Islamic State, but the costs all over Syria for bread, and the winter is coming. Things are likely to get harsher, and as a result, people are going to see the U.S. as the bad guy in this because they're the ones who did that and pushed more people into the arms of the Islamic State or even Jabhat al-Nusra likely. The good answer at this point, in my opinion, because things have gone down the road, it's more about containment and mitigating things. But didn't do anything for 3 years, so and had to draw up plans, suggests, and it's been conducted that they don't have the best intelligence necessarily on the ground, and they're also losing, narrative not only in Syria but also within many inside of DC. I mean, the fact that they said that they're striking a so-called Hura group, which doesn't actually exist, it's just individuals inside of Jabhat al-Nusra, which are al-Qaeda operatives. I'm not sure why they just didn't say they're killing al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra guys. They have this nickname. Problems ahead, unfortunately. I don't have good news.
Yeah. So, they have put in place some of the, some governance with, food, as you said, there's a lot of doctors and engineers. And, as we hear news, there's a huge influx of refugees coming into particularly Turkey, and it's becoming, a huge humanitarian issue. Do you then, with us, and, if we continue the way we are and, seeing, US as the bad guy, do you think of a lot of, instead of fleeing the country, moving to the regions and sort of going on?
That's the case because most people don't really like living under the Islamic State. It's just that people that are don't really have much of a choice. So you don't necessarily want to leave their homes, and as long as they don't cause trouble, they'll just deal with it. But in terms of other refugees, I highly doubt anybody will go to the Islamic State, since most of the refugees coming into Turkey now are Kurds, and the Kurds are from the Islamic State, and the Islamic State hates the Kurds because most of them are secular. View is, only like the Kurds that are truly Islamic according to their own, own interpretations. Right. But the humanitarian problem is a huge one. I mean, we've seen huge changes in demographics, and not just Turkey on the southern border related to the Kurds, which, it's more in the Arab world, but obviously there's the issue of the Kurds inside of Turkey, historically related to the Kurds wanting to have a state and annexing some of that territory. So the fact that there's more Kurds going in, that could push things. And then in the Lebanese side of things, we're seeing huge influx of Syrians that are going to Lebanon, and Lebanon is a very delicate balance within their society since it's confessional, and we know what happened in the 70s, 80s, related to their own civil war. So now that there are these Syrians that are about 1/5 to 1/4 of the population, and more are Sunnis, that really changes the dynamics, which then creates this fear of Shia population inside of Lebanon too. But because that fear in the Shia population, and then what Hezbollah does, that further creates, this fear within the Sunni population. It's just this endless existential cycle, which is what I personally think that this is going to go on for some time, and that it will be very difficult in many respects for, say, the United States to really mitigate or deal on it, since we're not the ones living in the region. The ones in the region are going to have to figure this out themselves somehow.
This leads into two questions that have been asked, and the first one is from Gordon Burke, and and he mentions that in the press, ISIS is very freely calling others unbelievers, and not just the Christians and other religions, but other Muslims. And so, the world or how do they feel about this, and how the rest of the world can declare ISIS as the unbelievers for what they're doing.
Well, the Muslim world has rejected them. I mean, you've had in a number of countries put out fatwas and statements condemning them. They're not true Muslims. You have Western Muslims coming out and condemning them. But people in the Islamic State, they don't care. They don't care what any of those people think. Why should they, based off of their own perception of the world? They view them as not true Muslims. So as a result, the nation isn't going to necessarily change the behavior of the Islamic State itself. It might be a way to deter others for potentially going, but I mean, it's the world against ISIS in many respects. I mean, you have both Arab states who have been involved in some of these strikes. You have Jordan, other countries involved, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, but you have other Muslim countries that are willing to help in other ways, not necessarily militarily, but you have Indonesia and Malaysia, and things like that. So there's a huge broad base of countries, figures, and individuals that are against it. The things are just so broken inside of Syria, and to I wouldn't say lesser extent, but all Iraq, that it's very difficult because many people don't like the Islamic State. There is no alternative to them necessarily within the Arab community. There's nobody strong enough because they're divided, or they don't really have much of or message. So let's say the Islamic State is kicked out of territory inside of Syria or Iraq. Who's going to fill that vacuum of governance? There really isn't anybody else. It's really on a neighborhood or village level. There's not a larger apparatus or group of individuals that have sort of a program like a liberal democracy or communism or other systems of government you could throw out there. And that's one of the issues that I have, is even though we're doing these airstrikes and potentially could push these individuals out, how sustainable is that in the long run? And how much it is. But I will see.
So, you mentioned, it should be dealt with regionally, and having, may not be the best solution. You mentioned earlier that, with a lot of the foreigners coming from Europe, things they see as, the failure of the government in Europe. Why it is the U.S. that's having to step forward and take charge and try to regulate the situation?
The capabilities to do it themselves. The logistical, the training, the money to do a long period of time. Only the United States does. That's a fact.
Yeah. Well, so are other enemies that, if we did have the ability to push them out, groups that are growing, and because a lot of conflict within the smaller groups within Syria fighting you know, are there any potentials, you know, maybe not in the immediacy, but somewhere down the road, being up? Or
it's possible, but it would take years, and who knows if it would be successful. Because the way the policy is borne out over the last 3 years, the individuals we want to work with don't have the same legitimacy as they used to have. It strikes further because many of the view them as a bunch of lackeys of the United States. I see a question in this application about Iran, which is important to address. It says, what outcome does Iran seek in this situation? What Iran wants in this situation is to have a government regime in place in Syria, the Hezbollah to be in place in Levant, and they want sort of a Shia government inside of Iraq. And that's why they've been active in building up proxy forces, whether it's militias, new militias inside of Syria, and that matter. And as a result, you know, one of the stories that really isn't being covered because everybody's focused on the Islamic State because they, you know, is more of an immediate threat to the West. What I see is it's a larger threat because they have state, you know, capabilities behind it. Is Iran, it's IRGC, Lebanese Hezbollah, and what they're doing regionally in terms of building up all these new proxies and allies, which further destabilizes a number of these countries. And it's not just in the areas that we've seen in Bahrain, Eastern Saudi Arabia, Northern Yemen. And that will just further antagonize the Sunni populations in many of these areas. So, you know, I think what Iran is doing is being up to any good at all, and they're, you know, in ways making it worse by what they're doing.
Asks is, you know, since the airstrikes are misguided and creating problems, and since the U.S. has taken as long as it has to step up to the plate, options do we have? You know, is there something else that's less forceful that we should be doing, or
do more stuff, but there's no political will in Western countries, and Arab governments don't want to take the burden. So we're going to go on this sort of middle path where things are done poorly, in my opinion. But that's the way it is, unless some large-scale event happens that's going to trigger some political truly change on the ground. You need a far larger military campaign, in my opinion. But I don't think that's politically feasible in the West. And if the countries don't want to do it, I don't see Arab governments stepping up and having their own troops on the ground there either, for political reasons as well. So, I mean, I think we'll see more of the same, where there'll be airstrikes, but you know, you really see large-scale progress. There'll be small political victories here and there, but not really strategically defeating the group.
Dana asks a question, which is a very tough question, and the create a middle between religion, ideology, and politics in the region. And a bit, but I don't think
that that's the role of the United States, and I don't think it's something the United States can accomplish unless the region want to create that themselves. That's, I mean, it's Ottomans coming in during the 30 Years' War and trying to be referee between the Catholics and Protestants. It's not going to happen. They fight their own battles in some ways, and continuing to get involved further exacerbated in many ways made the extremist sides on both sides stronger, and has continued to hurt the more pragmatic or individual region in many respects. So, really a bright future in the near term, maybe in like 100 to 150 years, but not 20 or 30 years, I don't think.
And the that are fighting Syria is ISIL or the only, or let me rephrase my question. Are the majority of people within Syria looking to have an Islamic form of government? Is this in particular, or are others fighting for a more democratic government?
Well, we're looking for a democratic form of government. There's a fight for that, but there's not that many. I mean, the fighters are just Islamists. They're just not as extreme as the Islamic State, have different interpretations. I mean, when we talk about Islam, it's really Islam's. I mean, there's one interpretation of Islam. There never has been. Anybody that says so is being simplistic and doesn't understand Islamic history. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra wants an Islamic State too, but it looks different than the one that ISIS wants. The Front wants an Islamic State, but that looks different than Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS. Jaysh al-Mujahideen, they want an Islamic State too, but that looks different than the Islamic Front, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, and on and on and on. So, groups you speak to, whether you're a group ISIS or have a group that wants to set up, I guess, an Islamic State, more akin to say Saudi Arabia, still a theocracy in many ways, but obviously it isn't always per se or as violent as the Islamic State, but or many people have been radicalized and they've taken refuge in religion.
I want to just remind people we have a few minutes left, so if you have any last-minute questions, please make sure you get those into us. The question is, do you think that do you think there's a threat of the spread of ISIS to other unstable areas, such as in northern Africa? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about Lebanon and Jordan being a little nervous, but what do you think about some of these other unsettled countries?
I mean, you already have other jihadi groups in those areas, so there's already competition. I mean, you have the Nafi Greek groups of Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, Ansar al-Sharia in Libya. There Jund al-Khilafa fi Arzair, or the Caliphate in the land of Algeria, but it seems like there's only like 20 to 30 individuals for now. Splinter group, because they're originally from HUIM, so they grow it all. They're the ones who were responsible for the beheading of the French tourist, I think last week, unfortunately. And then you have, one of the largest foreign groups or nationalities are Libya and Tunisia. They're two of the top three. The other one is Saudi Arabia. So many of the individuals that have come back home have incubated some of these groups with some of these more extreme ideologies. Ansar in Tunisia or Ansar al-Sharia in Libya hasn't pledged to ISIS, but some sympathies within the organization, and they're sort of straddling the line between being sympathetic to al-Qaeda or sympathetic to ISIS. Sort of sides. So certainly individuals in these countries that support the Islamic State. The question is whether they'll be enough to compete with other jihadi groups, or try and take over their own territory in other areas of those countries that haven't sort of been taken by other jihadi groups in some ways, and try annex them and say that it's part of this Islamic State, even if it's not contiguous. So I mean, we'll see, but you know, there's a lot of jihadis in North Africa, so it's not necessarily just the Islamic State.
There's a possibility that they might come to create a larger, more cohesive group in order to have influence that ISIS is having.
Different groups have different interests.
Yeah.
So it just depends on the particular group, and also depends on externalities, what's going on in the country, who is against them, you know, that depends a lot on it. All the Islamic State has done is help splinter some of these groups. So, you know, I think that, you know, them becoming some huge conglomerate is not likely, since that's not the norm within jihadism. Usually there's fights between different jihadis over time, just argue over really small, stupid stuff a lot of times. So, like that.
One of the things that's been mentioned quite a bit is how much money they have. They've gone about, you know, and things like that. And, you know, is there a way to, how do we deal with that, as, you know, with, and also trying to sort of cut their funding off, and in a way of doing that, besides boots on the ground?
Difficult, since they're a self-sustaining organization. Only about 5% of their money comes from private donors, whereas other groups like Al-Qaeda, AQAP, Jabhat al-Nusra, as well as others, primarily feed off of the private donors. ISIS is primarily self-sustaining, so they're involved in business rackets, kidnap for ransom, selling oil illegally, selling artifacts from ancient times legally, you know, taxes. You know, that's the basics that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there's like one or two things that I'm not remembering, but they're making a lot of money, especially off of the criminal enterprise. And unless you have, you know, people on the ground to do this, it's hard to really stop it. That's the reasons why the U.S., I think, bombed some of the oil refineries, even though the oil really was, you know, people talk about the oil, but it really wasn't the largest part of the money we're getting. It's really the criminal enterprise. And with the transition in Iraqi government and it not having assets in those areas anymore, and the fact that the Assad regime is nowhere in northern, the Islamic State really is, I mean, there's some, but it's not that large. It's really difficult. So it goes beyond the traditional Department tools that have been used to designate individuals and arrest others in countries, and to try and get them off the streets. So I'm not that type of stuff, so I can't get into more of what could be done. But it's you know, it's based off of conversations I've had, it's that a larger challenge than just dealing with private donations.
Let me ask, as we're running out of time, I have two questions. One is, what's the best way for, you know, the average person here in the U.S. to learn more about this and to keep updated? If you have suggestions of places to go for that. As well, I'm just wondering, I know you say you can see changes possibly, you know, 50 to 100 years down the road, but what do you see happening in, say, the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think will happen?
I don't like making predictions, especially about the Middle East. It's too quickly, and too much things change really quickly. You know, let alone 6 months out, let alone 5 to 10 years. I think it's easier to sort of see the broad, larger trends over decades than sort of trends. So I'm going to leave that. But in terms of following the news, I mean, primarily I from the source from these groups, so I speak Arabic, so I can read it from them. Of course, it's not realistic for most people, but a lot of the information I get is from people I trust on Twitter. Of course, that off the top of my head, and I know that's sort of a bad answer, but it's sort of just what comes up in my Twitter feed, to be honest. I don't really read newspapers or things like that. You know, if somebody links to something from a major newspaper, and I'll read it, but it's kind of random what I find based on what I'm on Twitter, to be honest.
Check out your blog, of course.
You go to Jihadology, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's just at AZLIN or Zelin, and I obviously link to things as well. So
great. Well, this has been very informative and overwhelming in a lot of ways. There's a lot going on, but I appreciate you taking time out to talk with us, and I hope that we will be able to have another conversation soon. Very much.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate the time.